All right, let's jump right in. Today, we're going to explore a really powerful teaching about how to live a life that actually matters. It's a way of looking at our time here that might just challenge everything. So, let's get started.
So, let's begin with a thought experiment. And I want you to be really honest with yourself here. If you knew with absolute certainty that you only had one day left, just one, what would you do? What would suddenly become your top priority, and what would just evaporate?
And that's the exact question this teaching starts with. If our time is that short, why on earth would we waste it being preoccupied with worldly matters? It just cuts right through all the noise of our day-to-day lives and makes us focus on what's truly essential.
Now, before we can figure out how to build a meaningful life, the teaching says we have to get real about our starting point. And that starting point, for every single one of us, is the reality of suffering.
Okay, what's so important here is how suffering, or dukkha, is framed. It's not some kind of personal failure. It's not something to be embarrassed about. It's just a normal, universal part of the human experience. It's something to be understood, to be worked with, not something we're supposed to constantly fight against.
And to really make this point land, the source gives us this incredible contrast. On the one hand, you have our life, right? Maybe 100 years if you're really lucky. It's this tiny, fleeting, precious moment. But then, on the other hand, you have this cycle of rebirth, samsara, a timescale so gigantic our minds can't even grasp it, where other beings can live for eons. You see the difference? It really highlights how urgent our situation is.
This little window, these 100 years, this is our shot. It's this incredibly brief opportunity we have to sort things out, to create some real value before that window slams shut. So the big question is, how do we actually do that?
Well, thankfully, this teaching doesn't just lay out the problem and leave us hanging. It also offers a really clear, practical path, a way to make sure this short life isn't just wasted.
And this path is essentially built on 5 key pillars. You have faith, morality, learning, generosity, and wisdom. Think of these as the fundamental building blocks for a life that actually has meaning and purpose.
So let's just quickly unpack these. Faith isn't blind belief, it's more like a deep trust in the path that's been laid out. Morality is all about our actions, things like not harming, not stealing, being honest. Learning is about actually engaging with these ideas. Generosity is the simple, powerful act of giving. And finally, wisdom. That's the end game. That's developing the insight to see things as they really are.
So, by actively working on these 5 areas, we're basically creating the conditions for a life well lived. The teaching is crystal clear on this. If you do this, your life will have value. It will not be a wasted chance.
But what about the flip side? What happens if we just don't do this? What are the real consequences of our everyday thoughts and actions? Well, this brings us to a really crucial idea, the power of habit. The opposite of cultivating that positive path is falling into what are called unwholesome states. We're talking about things like greed, anger, confusion, the classics. And these aren't just passing moods, they're thoughts and actions that actually build a kind of negative momentum in our minds. And here's how it works. The source explains that whatever we do repeatedly, the thoughts we think, the words we say, it's like we're carving a path in our own minds. What we indulge in becomes a latent tendency, a habit. It literally shapes who we are. You can see the progression here. It starts with repeating a negative action. That repetition then hardens into a habit, a default setting for the mind. So then, at that critical moment at the end of life, where do you think the mind goes? It just naturally drifts toward what it's most familiar with, what it has practiced over and over again. And the stakes, at least according to this teaching, are unbelievably high. A mind that's been trained, day in and day out, in these negative states is going to be drawn to a similar reality after death. This can lead to a rebirth in a realm of intense suffering, what's described as a hell realm, the animal world, or the world of hungry ghosts. Okay, so we've looked at the problem and the path to fix it, but the teaching saves its most profound, its most subtle point for last. This goes way beyond just building good habits. It gets to the absolute core of our experience. So, what is the ultimate protection? What's the final key to a life that's truly free from suffering? The source tells us the highest, most effective way to guard your mind is this, is to know that this mind is also not ours. Wow. I mean, that is a huge shift in perspective, right? After all that hard work of training and cultivating the mind, the very last step is to let go of your ownership of it, to stop identifying with it as me or mine.
So what does that actually look like? Well, it means letting go of our tight grip on the 5 aggregates.
Our body, our feelings, our perceptions, our thoughts, our consciousness. These are the basic components of what we think of as our self. The ultimate freedom, the teaching says, comes from seeing that these are just temporary, changing processes that we don't need to cling to.
And so we're left with this final, incredibly powerful question to think about. When you really consider how short our lives are and the tricky nature of our own minds, in the end, what are we really holding on to so tightly? And what might happen if we could just let go?